Hey guys, welcome back to Strictly Arcademic. Today we're going to examine the connection between Pokemon X and Y and the epistemological doctrine of Perspectivism. Before we continue on with the essay, however, just a couple of things. First, this video is going to presume familiarity with all of the whole narrative in both the main narrative, that is, in both Pokemon X and Y. So if you haven't played through those games, you might not get all you might not understand some of the things that I mention. So if that's the case, just go on Wikipedia, there should be a summary of it. I apologize for the visual fidelity on the Pokemon XY footage here, but my camera doesn't actually show preview. There's no screen on which to show preview footage. It's literally just a camera with almost zero interface. So I couldn't actually see how the DS looked to the camera. I was just holding the DS in front of the camera while playing it. I didn't really have any idea of how it looked. I tried a few times to record it, and every time, at least some of the DS was out of the shot. So I've given up, and I'm sorry when, at around about the 6-minute mark, the top of the DS starts encroaching into nothingness because I move it up too high. I do apologize for that, but it's something we're going to have to deal with. Okay, now let's get to it. If you're anything like me, a decent amount of time playing any Pokemon game is spent in chatting up NPCs with a view to scoring either A, plot or world information, or B, free items, something Pokemon games since White have been pretty liberal with. Whilst verbally shaking down the occupants of one Lumio City cafe in the Y version, I stumbled upon a woman who presented a 2-sentence judgment on immortality to me, with no contextual prompt of any kind. I'm certain that I'm not alone in the view that the main Pokemon games since White version have been touching upon some fairly ancillary, given the return of the Odyssey to adulthood via animal combat main narrative, weighty subject matter. White and Black went the ethical route, compelling the player to reflect on the ethics of Pokemon capture, training, and battle by stylizing the League of Antagonists as a Pokemon liberation group, whereas X and Y, while still touching upon ethics, tends to orient its gaze towards aesthetics and politics chiefly. This article, however, won't focus on the very occasional pronouncements of X and Y on immortality. Apart from the figure of AZ, it's brought up by maybe 2 NPCs once, but rather how the central narrative and themes of X and Y invoke the theory of perspectivism concerning knowledge. Thus, to preface the discussion of Pokemon proper, I'll offer a brief sketch of perspectivism so you guys have some idea of what I'm talking about. Dialogue and other text in Pokemon X and Y is pregnant with the notion that knowledge and aesthetic appreciation are both limited and informed or composed by the perspective from which one encounters the relevant object. In and of itself, this is nothing special. A certain consensus reigns in public discourse to the effect that perception, and as a consequence, knowledge, is influenced or shaped by one's particular history or special relationship to that which is viewed and or known. However, there exists a more popular image of ideal knowledge as that which is stripped of the individuality of the knower, without which, after all, it would not be as it is. On this view, a perceiving subject gleans what they know of a thing through direct, unmediated perception of this. Alongside this, the ideal projection of the scientist as here, sponge-like, a passive recipient of unfiltered knowledge, and there, as a subject caught between two worlds, the creative rush of poetry and the self-objectification or alienation of scientific rigor. This perspective requires, to remain coherent, the affirmation of a view known as naive realism. That is to say, that the view that sense perception is a direct, unfiltered representation of an external reality which exactly mirrors it, and thus that all perceptions of a single object in a certain state will be identical, if the perceivers are perceived to be relatively or equal enough. Our intellectual history would be nothing without the emergence of a band of rogues to contradict the status quo, and in this respect, the call was answered by a view which held that perceptions, the agent who experiences them, and the historico-social context in which the experiential agent is embedded, are inextricably bound together, and as such, the perception and knowledge of one knower will necessarily deviate from that of another. A consequence of this is, naturally, that knowledge ceases to refer to the common content of the universal perception of a thing, but rather becomes a sort of collaborative project akin to crowdfunding, with agents comparing and contrasting their experiences in order to generate an emergent collage to be added to and revised over time. This epistemology, termed Perspectivism, is most often associated with the thought of Nietzsche, and is something of a compromise between traditional empirical realism and solipsistic, idealistic skepticism. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche argues that perspectivism is a theory of knowledge which acknowledges that intermediary stage in human perception between receiving raw perceptual data and understanding what it is that one perceives, namely, the interpretation of sense data by the sensing subject. Prior to Nietzsche, the philosopher Immanuel Kant drew a conceptual distinction between reality as a perceiving subject, that is, you or I, understands it through sense perception, dubbing this reality the phenomenal world, and reality as it exists independently of perception, also known as the noumenal world, or things in themselves. Having thus partitioned these two spheres, Kant refrained that as one cannot abandon sense perception so that one might understand the external world without any filtration or immediate process, knowledge of the noumenal is impossible. Sense perception is the epistemological barrier that human beings cannot transcend, and the axes of space and time are necessary conditions for our being able to understand anything which isn't true by definition. That's excluding his discussion of the concept of the synthetic a priori, but that'll be deviating too much from the subject of what I have to say to get into that discussion. Through his extensive study of Schopenhauer, a German acolyte of Kantian philosophy notable for his pessimism, Nietzsche extended the scope of this Kantian thesis, namely, that just as one cannot emancipate oneself from spatiality and temporality in order to view the external world without them, that is, space or time, one cannot emancipate oneself from the causal, socio-historical, or experimental context within which one's subjectivity resides, and from which one perceives what one does. These contexts, in which all perception is grounded, influence how one interprets the data one receives, and, as a consequence, determine what one knows as a result of that interpretation. Nietzsche uses a powerful analogy to defend his argument. To imagine that when approaching an article of knowledge, the knowing subject casts aside its history, relativity in space, time, causation, ideology, etc., in order to comprehend it in itself, or without filtration, is akin to imagining, quote, an eye which looks out in no particular direction, an eye which either lacks or otherwise restrains the active powers of interpretation which first make seeing into seeing something. For here, then, a nonsense and a non-concept is demanded of the eye. End quote. Just as any eye is always looking in a particular direction, and is thus not looking in others, any knowing subject is knowing of a thing from a particular perspective or context, and not knowing, that is, missing ideas, details possessed by other knowers about the same object, from other perspectives or contexts. This conclusion does not entail, as one might be tempted to infer off that knowledge is impossible, or that all perspectives are equally meritorious. What it does entail, however, is a revision in the concept and demands of objective knowledge. As Nietzsche writes, quote, perspectival seeing is the only kind of seeing there is, perspectival knowing the only kind of knowing, and the more feelings about a matter which we allow to come to expression, the more eyes, different eyes, through which we are able to view this same matter, the more complete our conception of it, our objectivity, will be. Knowledge under perspectivism is a collaborative, continuous process, in which criticism and augmentation are tools for refining one's image of an object of knowledge, gleaned from the intercourse of speakers. In contrast to the myth of the solitary knower of older epistemologies, gleaning details of an object by direct, unfiltered perception of it. That is the end of my kind of summary exposition of what perspectivism is. Of course, it's not fully detailed, and I don't answer objections against perspectivism in favor of other views, like naive realism or idealism or phenomenalism. But that will be way outside the scope of what I'm trying to do here. So I'm just trying to define perspectivism functionally so you guys know what I'm talking about when I use the word. Otherwise, it'd be even more messy. Alright, so now on to Pokemon and what that has to tell us about perspectivism. Although whispers of perspectivist sentiment can be found all over the place in Pokemon X and Y, one need only visit the Lumiose Museum to find readily available samples. For instance, a couple might are beautiful and embarrassing when examining the same painting, with the obvious inference that beautiful and embarrassing are not properties of the painting itself, otherwise its perception would not differ between the two viewers, but it is an emergent relationship of artwork and audience. An old man says, quote, to try and use words to capture the beauty of a painting is like eating the menu instead of the meal, end quote. The notion expressed here is that a linguistic expression is not just inadequate in accounting for the beauty of a painting, but incompatible. The implication being that the content of a painting is the brute intuition one feels when one looks at it, which is incommensurable with language. You can't translate that into language. Another man exclaims, "So this is what the sea looks like to the artist." To the artist implies divergence from his own perspective, and the man's curiosity at discovering another perspective of the same object is perspectivist pseudo-objectivity in action. Narratively speaking, the spectre of perspectivism is conjured by the fact that most of the conflicts the protagonist is introduced to over the course of the game find their roots in incongruent interpretations of the consequences of actions or the situation before them. Lysandre's highly unorthodox utilitarianism, confronted with his anxiety concerning the scarcity of resources, urges him towards the annihilation of most of the world's population, that those who remain might enjoy a richness of existence otherwise unsustainable, preserving beauty, as Lysandre might put it. The friends of the protagonists and Professor Sycamore insist, pretty vaguely, that the genocidal effort required to render scarcity a non-issue is not worth the refinement in the quality of life for those left behind, however beautiful such lives might be. This moral is, funnily enough, reinforced in the tale of AZ and his Flabébé. Tormented with existential guilt in understanding that many Pokemon died to fuel its resurrection, AZ's Flabébé wrestles with its anguish in a 3,000-year separation from its trainer, age and desperation contorting AZ into a hulking symbol of, as a perplexing NPC in one of Lumios's cafes points out, the profound weariness of immortality. Despite granting it eternal life, Flabébé's rejection of AZ's companionship signifies an ethical rejection of political philosophies like Lysandre's. In having both humans and Pokemon recoil at the idea of consequentialist sacrifice, Pokemon X and Y stresses that there is a primal repugnance in sentient creatures towards such an action, and that this reaction is grounded in the empathy that most creatures of understanding have towards other creatures like them. This core narrative conflict is also represented thematically, or symbolically. Lysandre's aesthetico-politics places a symbolic premium on the ideas of stasis, stillness, and immutability. Lysandre speaks of preserving beauty, of a beautiful society being one which does not change, in which quality of life is able to be maintained in its present state by eliminating other consumers, etc. When speaking with Diantha, the movie star, in a Lumiose cafe early in the game, he inquires as to whether or not Diantha fears the effects of aging on her beauty, specifically with reference to the time when the image in her mirror no longer corresponds to the image on film. Her response, that aging is inevitable and she shall not curse its consequences, disturbs Lysandre, an admirer of Diantha's beauty, who expresses a desire to conserve beauty forever, to eternalize it in a manner analogous to film and other representative arts. Sycamore and the protagonist's friends, on the contrary, value variety, difference, and otherness, with Sycamore's most consistent ethical advice being to empathize with and understand the values of those who differ from one's own. This valorization of multiplicity is expressed in the specific interests of the protagonist's friends, with Tierno aiming to study the varying moods of the Pokemon and incorporating them into his own dancing, Shauna seeking to create unique memories along her journey, and Trevor seeking to complete the Pokédex, that is, become intimate with the diversity of Pokemon species. Even Sycamore acts as a symbol for diversity by battling with Pokemon who are both super effective to and weak to another Pokemon in his party. The perspectivist nugget here is that the conflict is the fruit of the two agencies interpreting the same event, scarcity, and deriving responses from their aesthetic or ethical sensibilities. Lysandre's obsession with beauty and changelessness impels him towards mass murder, whereas the students of Sycamore, operating on the notion that difference and change is to be embraced, ground their opposition to him. Although Sycamore's kids, or the professor himself for that matter, lack a substantive ethics to propound in contrast to Lysandre's, and thus have no alternative solution to the problem of scarcity, their reverence for difference and love for Pokemon, thereby reflecting the player, is enough to provoke stern opposition, and thus to render this an example of perspectivism and its consequence being a core component in a game's narrative. In addition to tackling philosophical themes avoided by many games from major studios, Pokemon X and Y manages to pull off a feat seldom achieved in fiction generally speaking, let alone game development, a flawed yet genuinely sympathetic antagonist. Indeed, Lysandre is introduced upon arrival in Lumiose City as a friend of sycamores, with an immediately noticeable penchant for the colour red, and discussing aesthetics. His intense dislike of change and aging is noticed by his interlocutors, but dismissed as standard existential anxiety coming from a person whose heart, fundamentally, is in the right place. When later in the game, Lysandre's intent to commit mass murder is revealed, he takes great pains to establish that he does not relish the idea at all, interpreting the burden of guilt as something he must bear as a loyal advocate of beauty, given his binary prediction concerning a future under scarcity, namely, that either population and consumption will continue beyond sustainability until all beauty is gone, or that titanic culling will ensure that those who remain alive remain happy. Lysandre feels that, although gruesome beyond comprehension, to preserve some bliss and beauty through killing everyone else that's required is better than allowing it all to succumb to an infinitely expanding demand. Although outlandish in presentation and extreme in measure, this kind of impulse is one which is understandable as a reaction to being confronted with a situation in which resources dwindle alongside climbing necessity for them. One's ability to sympathize with Lysandre is only amplified by the fact that X and Y's merry band of heroes really lack any kind of ethical or political vision to challenge him. As compelling as they are as personal motivations, a blanket opposition to killing and reaffirming one's love for Pokemon just aren't going to assuage someone with anxieties about sustainability as profound as Lysandre's. Herein lies that delicious tension endemic to a tale with both sympathetic protagonists and antagonists. We appreciate the fact that Lysandre's case is the most powerful intellectually, while simultaneously chanting along with the reservations of the protagonists. Despite the fairly general perception as a series for children, Pokemon X and Y engages in the kind of nuanced ethical thought matched by the other profoundly deep games of 2013, The Last of Us, Papers, Please, and Grand Theft Auto 5. These two camps, Team Flare and Sycamore's heroes, born of the fruit of clashing interpretations of the same event, propose reactions which seem to assure doom for those concerned. On the one hand, intentional massive murder, and on the other, societal collapse under the weight of scarcity and animal nature. What is the ultimate moral of Pokemon X and Y? Is it that any consistent ethics entail some sort of undesirable consequence? That the consequences of one's actions aren't as important in the ethical evaluation of a person as the principles in accordance with which they acted? Perhaps Sycamore and his gang are to be lauded for their insistence on the primacy of maintaining a harmonious relationship with nature, Pokemon, in the face of certain death over attempts to stave off destruction at the cost of our prior sense of selves. Whatever one does conclude, you can be certain that it is, at the end of it all, a matter of perspective. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say, and I'll see you again soon.